Hello and welcome from Echoes of the Forgotten Earth, a quiet corner where curiosity tends to wander slowly, and the past sits gently beside your evening. Tonight, I'd like to invite you to settle in and drift with me into a tale that began long before any of us, yet somehow still hums in our bones and lingers in our oldest stories. It is a tale of water, of a world that once seemed on the verge of drowning in its own thaw. Picture yourself at the edge of the planet 12,000 years ago. The air still holds the chill of the waning ice age. The seas are uneasy. The land itself is changing shape from season to season. Tonight, we'll walk together through what Earth was like in the aftermath of a vast flood. The mysterious interval when ice sheets melted, oceans surged forward, and humanity had to relearn how to stand on a transformed planet. Before we wander too far backward, though, I'm curious about you. Where are you listening from right now? Maybe you're near a shoreline. Maybe you're far inland. Maybe you can hear rain lightly tapping on your window. Or perhaps you're wrapped in a still, quiet night. There's something fitting about talking of floods and waters while, somewhere in this very moment, rivers are running and tides are turning, reshaping their own tiny landscapes. What's it like where you are right now? And if this journey feels calming to you, if it helps you loosen the day from your shoulders or stirs that quiet sense of wonder, I'd be grateful if you'd tap like or subscribe. It helps this small refuge from echoes of the forgotten earth find others who might also need a calm voice to accompany them toward rest. Now let's step back onto that ancient earth, 12,000 years in the past. When we think about floods, we often imagine a sudden storm, a river spilling violently beyond its banks, familiar streets turning into temporary streams. But what unfolded back then was not a single storm or one river gone wild. It was the slow, immense unraveling of an ice age. Colossal glaciers that had once draped whole continents were melting away. For tens of thousands of years, they had locked up enormous volumes of the planet's water, pressing down on the land with almost unimaginable weight. When those sheets of ice finally began to withdraw, the world itself shifted. Seas climbed higher, valleys filled, coastlines marched inland, swallowing forests, plains, and anything that had lived or walked there before. Imagine entire shorelines erased, not in a single day, but steadily, relentlessly, year after year. A farm here, a hunting ground there, until whole regions slipped beneath the advancing waves. It didn't roar in like a disaster movie. It crept. But to the people living then, its slow persistence was no less dramatic. For those whose lives were tightly woven to the land, it must have seemed as though Earth itself had become restless. They would have watched familiar trails vanish. River edges widen. New islands appear where there had never been any. A sense that nothing was fixed must have seeped into ordinary days. Imagine following a path your parents knew by heart, only to find it gone, replaced by a marsh or a widening bay. Imagine losing not only a house, but an entire landscape. The flood is most often remembered in the language of myth and legend. From Mesopotamia to the Indian subcontinent, from the Americas to scattered Pacific islands, stories of a great deluge appear again and again. The details change, but the emotional core does not. A world overwhelmed by water, people scrambling for high ground, survivors carrying the story forward. Myths have a way of holding experiences that are too big, too frightening, too slow, or too vast to capture with everyday words. It may be that our great flood stories are echoes of how our ancestors remembered the long catastrophe of their rising seas. What felt like the wrath of gods may have been the planet reshaping itself at the close of an age of ice. Even when you strip away the mythology, the science is just as striking. Roughly 12,000 years ago, global sea levels rose by hundreds of feet compared with their lowest point during the Ice Age. Coastlines were utterly different from the ones we recognize on maps today. Stand where modern cities now hum, London, New York, Tokyo, and Back then, you would likely have been standing miles inland, with the sea a distant line on the horizon. Once the great melt had run its course, those coastlines marched inland. Much of what people once called home now lies beneath the waves. Many researchers suspect that countless ancient sites camps, villages, perhaps early sacred places, remain buried offshore on continental shelves, drowned by the post-glacial rise, waiting quietly to be found. The world after the waters wasn't just wetter, it was warmer. As the glaciers dissolved, they didn't merely release water, they altered climates. Rivers swelled with melt, carving their valleys deeper, carrying rich silt across plains, spreading nutrients that would later feed the first attempts at farming. In many regions, earth grew greener. Forests expanded into land that had known only ice and tundra. Air held more moisture. Storm tracks shifted. Whole ecosystems reorganized themselves. It was an age of endings, yes, but also of beginnings. For people, these were not abstract forces. They determined where you could live, what you could eat, and whether your children would survive. Entire groups of humans had to move as their homes sank under encroaching seas. Some pushed inland, some followed new rivers. Others learned to live with the widening ocean, turning toward fishing, and in time, the first simple craft to ride the waves. It was an era of adaptation, of problem solving, of resilience. Maybe this is why so many flood tales end with renewal instead of ruin. Out of loss come new ways of living. Out of drowning comes rebirth. If you close your eyes, you might see a small family gathered by a fire at the edge of what had once been dry ground. The night is calm, except for the steady rhythm of water at the newly formed shore. Grandparents remember a village that once stood farther out, now long buried under the sea. Their grandchildren will never know that place existed at all. To them, the water has simply always been there. That is what happens when nature moves faster than memory. The flood wasn't the same everywhere. Different parts of the world experienced it in different ways. In some regions, such as around what are now the Great Lakes of North America, melting ice created vast inland seas that rewrote the map. In others, like the Mediterranean basin, swollen rivers poured into lowlands and basins, drowning valleys that had been dry for ages. In Southeast Asia, extensive low-lying plains surrendered to the ocean while islands shrank, becoming scattered fragments of what had once been larger landmasses. Every culture, every small community, would have had its own account of what the waters took and what they left. It's worth pausing here because 12,000 years ago can sound impossibly distant, as if we're talking about another kind of human altogether. But in the span of human history, it isn't so far. Our ancestors were already adept toolmakers, artists, and storytellers. They painted on cave walls. They made jewelry. They built shelters against weather and predators. They loved and raised children. They mourned loss. For them, rising waters were not an entry in a geological timeline. They were as immediate as weather, as constant as hunger, as present as hope. When you see it that way, the flood stops being just prehistory. It turns into lived experience as vivid and emotional as anything we feel now. So what was Earth truly like in the wake of the Great Flood? It was a planet between eras, where horizons wouldn't stay put, where maps were redrawn not by ink but by water. An age was closing. Another was opening. And as the land transformed, so did the beings who walked upon it, from mammoths dwindling in number to humans stepping carefully into a new kind of world. That, perhaps, is where our journey from echoes of the forgotten Earth truly begins. When we talk about memory, we usually mean our own. A handful of moments we carry like small keepsakes in the mind, fading or sharpening depending on how often we turn them over. But some memories outlive a single lifetime. They slip into stories and rituals, into songs and legends, passed from one generation to the next, until they belong not to one person, but to an entire people. The story of a great flood belongs to that deeper kind of memory. What happened 12,000 years ago was far more than a shift in temperatures or shorelines. For those who lived through it, it was a dividing line, a before and an after. When the very land beneath your feet rearranges itself, that experience doesn't fade easily. It lingers. It's told and retold around fires, carried as a warning, guarded in song, shaping itself into something larger than any one memory, something approaching myth. Look almost anywhere in human culture, and you will find its echo. It's there in the story of Noah in the Hebrew Bible, where rains fall for 40 days and nights until only those in the ark remain. It's there in the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest written works we have, where the gods unleash a flood to purge the world, and one man is instructed to build a vessel to preserve life. It appears in Hindu tradition, in which the god Vishnu, in the form of a fish, warns Manu of an oncoming deluge and guides him to build a boat carrying the seeds of life. It's told among the Hopi, the Ojibwe, and many other indigenous nations of North America, where waters rise and only those who listen to animals, to spirits, to sacred messengers are able to survive. Even in places as distant from each other as Polynesia and Scandinavia, we find tales of overwhelming waters woven into cultural memory. Yes, floods occur everywhere. Rivers overspill, storms drive in surges, tsunamis strike without warning. But the way flood stories saturate the world's mythologies suggests something more than a patchwork of local disasters. It hints at a shared echo of a global transformation, a time when waters didn't just rise for a season, but redrew the contours of the earth. For communities living near coasts and rivers 12,000 years ago, the post-Ice Age rise in sea level must have felt like watching the world slowly drown. On the scale of rocks and ice, the changes were gradual. On the scale of human lives, the difference between a safe home and a lost one might be no more than a single generation. That is all it takes for an event to carve itself into culture. Imagine a community living on what is now continental shelf, back when it was open ground. To them, the sea would have been a distant line, miles away, a faint horizon of salt and tide. Year after year, they watched that horizon creep closer. Foraging fields turned to marshes, burial grounds vanished under brackish water. Trees that had once stood firmly on dry land slowly drowned at their roots. Elders spoke of where the shore used to be. Children grew up hearing about places they would never walk because the ocean had taken them. For us, all this is numbers and graphs, sea level curves, bathymetric maps, sediment cores. For them, it was their sacred places, their food, their homes, their dead. When we look at these old myths through that lens, they stop feeling like pure fantasy and start looking more like cultural records, distorted by time, but deeply rooted. The flood at the edge of memory may not recount a single storm or 1 year of heavy rain. Instead, it carries the shape of a long, slow catastrophe, the world filling with meltwater. The way those stories frame it through gods, through anger, through judgment and survival, shows how people tried to give sense and meaning to a change they had no tools to explain. Why were the waters rising? Why did the world itself feel different in an age before geology, before climate science, before satellites and charts? The only language they had for such questions was story, and it's striking how often these flood stories emphasize not only ruin, but endurance. There's always someone who hears the warning, someone who builds the boat, someone who climbs to the high ground. The flood does not end the human story, it re-begins it. In that way, these narratives lean more toward resilience than despair. They say, yes, the waters came. Yes, the world was altered. But life went on. We remained. That may be why such tales were worth repeating. They preserved not only fear of the flood, but faith in what could grow after it. The idea of cultural memory leads us to an important question. How can we tell which myths echo real events? Archaeologists and anthropologists look for patterns. When a similar kind of story appears in many distant cultures, and when its details line up with what geology and climate records show, it suggests those stories may be anchored in real experiences. In Australia, for example, indigenous oral traditions describe coastlines and landmarks that are now submerged but were once dry land during the Ice Age. These stories were passed down for thousands of years, long before anyone wrote anything down. Yet they match modern reconstructions of what those ancient coasts actually looked like. That tells us oral memory can survive far longer than we often assume, holding onto the outlines of floods and shoreline shifts across immense spans of time. So when we hear of a world-drowning deluge, it may be unwise to shrug and say, just a myth. Perhaps these tales are cracked mirrors, stylized records of how life felt as the glaciers melted. The flood at the edge of memory might be humanity's way of holding on to an event too large to fully grasp, but too important to ever let slip entirely. Picture again a small group thousands of years ago, explaining to their children why the land looks the way it does, why the coast seems new, why the rivers run wider now, why shells can be found so far from the sea. They would have used the only explanations they had. The gods were angry. The spirits had chosen to cleanse the land. The world had been washed and remade. Those stories carried warning as much as meaning. They helped the next generation understand a world that refused to stay still. In that sense, the flood at the edge of memory was less about the past alone, and more about teaching people how to survive whatever came next. These memories did not stay confined to one valley or one shoreline. They traveled as people did. When groups migrated to new territories, they carried their flood stories along. Over time, the tales absorbed new landscapes, new languages, new deities. The core remained. Waters rose and changed everything, but the details shifted with each retelling. In a desert culture, a flood might be remembered as a nearly unimaginable punishment, water where water never should be. In a river culture, it might become part of a recurring cycle flood and renewal, destruction and fertility. On islands, it might blend into origin stories of land rising from or sinking back into the sea. The universality of these tales doesn't come from identical plots, but from a shared memory of overwhelming water. What makes all of this even more compelling is how these myths intersect with what science is uncovering now. Sediment cores from the ocean floor show abrupt pulses of fresh water entering the seas during the Great Melt. Geological surveys reveal drowned river valleys that today form the seafloors of our coastlines. Fossils of plants and land animals lie beneath the waves, evidence of once dry landscapes now forgotten by everything except stone. Each discovery rhymes in its own way with what the stories say. It is as though science is slowly catching up to something human imagination has carried all along. Another question rises here. Why are flood myths so dominant compared to stories about other disasters? Ancient people endured earthquakes, volcanoes, droughts, and plagues, yet it is the flood that saturates global myth. Perhaps it is because water is both life and threat. We cannot live without it, yet in excess, it can sweep away everything. Floods are also visible transformations. You can stand there and watch the waters climb, watch the land disappear. The change is undeniable. And when that change is not temporary, but permanent, as it was 12,000 years ago, it leaves a scar, not only on coasts, but on minds. So when we speak of the flood at the edge of memory, we are really speaking about two overlapping realities. One is geologic, the post-Ice Age rise in seas and the catastrophic draining of glacial lakes. The other is cultural, the ways humans remembered and reworked those experiences into story. One is written in stone and shorelines, the other is written in myth and ritual. Together they form a double archive of the same transformation, one kept by the earth itself, the other kept by us. Those ancient memories still shape us in ways we often don't notice. Flood myths still circulate in religious traditions, novels, films. They carry moral weight and cautionary themes about arrogance, about ignoring warnings, about the possibility of renewal after devastation. They remind us that water has always been both a blessing and a boundary. And they remind us that no matter how advanced we believe we've become, we remain vulnerable to the same forces that tested our ancestors. Listening to these stories is, in a sense, listening to the Earth through human voices. The planet doesn't speak in sentences. It speaks through shifting climates, rising seas, growing forests, vanishing ice. Humans translate those changes into narrative. Sometimes those narratives endure much longer than we expect, bridging the space between ancient experience and modern understanding. As we follow this thread deeper, we find ourselves not only in the past, but at a crossroads where memory and geology meet. The flood is at once a physical event and a cultural monument, remembered on every continent in countless tongues, yet always pointing to the same root truth. There was a time when waters rose, and the world was never quite the same again. When the Ice Age began to slacken its grip, it did not release the planet in a single dramatic crack. There was no one loud thaw. Instead, there was a long, steady retreat, an unbuilding of ice that had taken tens of thousands of years to accumulate. Picture ice sheets taller than mountain ranges, sprawling across continents, flattening valleys and burying entire regions under silence and cold. For generations, that was the backdrop of human life. Then slowly, the balance tipped. Temperatures edged upward. What had been frozen for ages began to melt. This was not a gentle dripping from icicles. It was a cascade that rewrote the face of the world. The retreat of the ice is what set the Great Flood in motion. As the glaciers collapsed, they released staggering volumes of water into the oceans. Sea levels surged, creeping inland and reshaping shorelines in ways that no one could ignore. Land bridges that had once linked continents began to sink beneath the waves. The Bering Land Bridge, the broad stretch of Earth that once connected Siberia to Alaska, gradually disappeared. For countless generations, humans and animals had crossed it, moving from Asia into the Americas and back again, following herds and seasons. After the melt, that route was gone. The Americas stood apart, separated from Asia by the cold, deep water we know today. Europe changed as well. The wide lowlands that once linked Britain with mainland Europe, known to archaeologists as Doggerland, were slowly flooded. What had been forests, rivers, and meadows turned first to marsh, then to sea. People hunted there, lived there, buried their dead there. As the waters advanced, they had to abandon those familiar places, moving inland or adapting to shrinking coasts. Even now, fishing nets sometimes bring up tree remains, animal bones, or ancient tools from the North Sea fragments of that drowned country. The end of the ice did more than raise the water. It changed the shape of continents themselves. Glaciers had pressed the crust down like enormous hands. When that weight lifted, the land began to spring back, a slow-motion rebound known as isostatic adjustment. In some regions, new shorelines rose from the sea even as global water levels climbed. Rivers changed their courses. Lakes drained or expanded. The map was redrawn in the span of a few generations. For those alive then, the world must have felt unstable, as if the ground itself had become unpredictable. Scientists estimate that at the height of the last ice age, global sea level was more than 120 meters, almost 400 feet lower than it is today. Vast areas of what we now call seafloor were exposed as dry land. As the ice melted, all that space was slowly reclaimed by the ocean. Over several thousand years, sea level rose steadily, punctuated by occasional dramatic surges when enormous glacial lakes burst their ice dams and spilled into the sea. One such event, the draining of a huge glacial lake in North America, may have dumped so much fresh water into the Atlantic that it disrupted ocean currents and altered climate patterns worldwide for centuries. Imagine standing at the edge of one of those lakes, a body of fresh water larger than all of today's Great Lakes combined. To the human eye, it would look endless, a horizon of shimmering surface under the open sky. Then, in a single season, the ice dam fails. The entire lake begins to drain. Water thunders through valleys, tearing up forests, carving new canyons. Downstream, rivers swell into roiling walls, sweeping away anything in their path. The surge finally slams into the ocean, nudging sea level upward in a geological instant. For anyone living near that path, this was not myth. It was catastrophe. As the ice retreated, it left behind scraped, raw land, but that emptiness didn't last. Moss and lichen took root first, then grasses, then shrubs and trees. Animals followed. Reindeer, bison, smaller mammals, and later species that could handle the new warmth. Humans followed them in turn, adjusting their ways of life as quickly as the environment changed. Where they once hunted across open tundra, they now fished in broad rivers and foraged in spreading forests. But through all of this, the sea kept rising. It didn't rush in like a tidal wave. It crept at the pace of a few millimeters or centimeters a year. Yet across a single lifetime, that was enough to swallow fields, paths, and camps. People watched places their grandparents had used disappear beneath the waves. They felt a slow grief, not only for lost resources, but for lost belonging. Sacred sites, hunting grounds, burial fields, all gone under the same indifferent water. The reshaping of the planet in this period was global. In Asia, wide coastal plains submerged, pushing human communities inland. In the Pacific, low-lying regions shrank, turning once larger land masses into archipelagos. In South America, melting Andean glaciers fed mighty rivers that carried nutrients across the continent, helping to create the incredible diversity of the Amazon. Everywhere the story repeated: ice withdrawing, oceans advancing, land changing. And yet, for all its violence, the retreat of the ice also prepared the ground for the world we know. Without those rising seas, many of our familiar coastlines would not exist. Without the redistribution of water, our climate patterns would be entirely different. The end of the Ice Age was both a dismantling and a creation, a closing and an opening. We sometimes picture the distant past as standing still, waiting patiently for us to arrive. But 12,000 years ago, the world was anything but still. It was restless. People alive then had to live inside that restlessness, not in spite of it. They had no choice but to adapt their tools, travels, and traditions to a world in motion. Their resilience was extraordinary. They carried stories, skills, and stone blades into lands that had only recently emerged from under ice. They found ways to survive along unpredictable coasts, behind new river systems, in newborn forests. The retreat of the ice and the rise of the seas tested humanity. It also forged in us a capacity for adaptation that we still draw on today. Think, too, about how this changing world shaped human imagination. To watch seas climb and land recede, to see glaciers withdraw like living walls of ice, must have left people with the eerie sense that Earth itself was alive, capable of reshaping itself on its own terms. That feeling found its way into myths of gods raising mountains, dropping islands, sending floodwaters, ending worlds and beginning them again. The physical became spiritual because there was no other way to explain the scale of what they saw. The retreat of the ice and the surge of the seas were not just natural events. They formed the backdrop on which humans painted their earliest ideas of power, change, and survival. If you had stood on one of those ancient shores and watched the tide creep a little higher every year, you wouldn't have thought in terms of carbon dioxide or glacial dynamics. You would have thought in terms of home, of where to find food, where to shelter, where your children might live. At that human scale, geological change becomes personal. It becomes memory, and memory, in turn, becomes myth. That is why, even now, we can feel something stir inside us when we hear stories of ancient floods. They remind us that we too live on a changing planet, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly, but always in ways that demand we adapt. As the ice withdrew and oceans filled the space it left behind, another great transformation unfolded along the edges where land meets sea. We tend to think of coastlines as sharp, permanent lines on a map, as if the boundary between blue and green has always been drawn exactly where we see it. But 12,000 years ago, that line was on the move. As the waters climbed, coasts changed in ways that would have felt both gradual and final to the people watching. Land that had been walked for generations disappeared. River mouths shifted from opening into fertile valleys to spilling into salt water. Hills that once rose above broad plains became islands. Whole regions vanished beneath the waves. Those drowned coastlines became silent evidence of water's power to rewrite the face of the world. One of the most haunting examples lies below today's North Sea. To ships and fishermen, it's just a busy stretch of water. But beneath it lies a lost landscape known as Doggerland. During the Ice Age, Doggerland was not seabed. It was a broad, gentle plain, cut by rivers and dotted with lakes, forests, and wildlife. It connected what we now call Britain to mainland Europe, forming a continuous corridor for people and animals. It wasn't empty. It was home. Small bands of hunter-gatherers lived there, tracking red deer, fishing in winding rivers, scavenging along lake shores. They raised families, buried their dead, and told their own stories beneath skies that now reflect only waves. As seas rose, Doggerland began to shrink. Coastal marshes spread where solid ground had been, low-lying areas filled with standing water. Camps were abandoned. Familiar paths became muddy inlets, then open sea. In the end, the ocean claimed everything. Today, trawlers sometimes pull up pieces of bone, antlers, or flint tools from the seafloor, proof that beneath those gray waters, a once living world lies drowned and silent. Doggerland is not alone. Across what is now Southeast Asia, a vast plain called Sundaland once stretched from the Asian mainland out to areas that are now islands, Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and beyond. Rivers flowed across a vast lowland, and what we think of today as scattered islands were once connected ridges and hills above an expansive landscape. As seas rose, Sundaland fragmented. Valleys went under. Ridges became islands. Routes that had once been traveled on foot now required boats. Communities that had been neighbors across open ground found themselves separated by channels of water. That breakage changed how people moved, traded, and shared ideas. It helped shape the complex mosaic of languages and cultures we see in island Southeast Asia today. To the people who lived through that change, it would not have been an abstract rearrangement of geography. It was their world shattering and reassembling into something unfamiliar. The Persian Gulf holds another chapter of this story. At the height of the Ice Age, it wasn't a gulf at all, but a broad river valley. Rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates flowed through a lush basin that may have offered a sheltered refuge for humans and animals alike. Some researchers think it might have been one of the most fertile regions of the ancient world. As global seas climbed, that valley flooded, transforming into the shallow gulf we know today. People living along those rivers would have watched their camps and villages slide from inland safety to the very edge of the encroaching sea, and then beneath it. For them, a world really did end underwater. It's no wonder that so many flood stories from the wider Mesopotamian region speak of waters that covered everything. Off the coast of India and the Gulf of Kambat, sonar surveys have revealed patterns on the seafloor that some interpret as geometric, almost architectural. There is still active debate about whether these are natural formations or remnants of human-made structures. Pottery fragments and stone tools from the area do at least confirm that people once lived where there is now only water. Whether or not those offshore formations are true ruins, the idea itself resonates because it fits the larger pattern. So much land was drowned 12,000 years ago that countless early settlements, some simple, some perhaps surprisingly complex, may now lie hidden under silt and salt. Near Japan's Yonaguni Island, divers have explored stepped, terrace-like formations under the sea. Some scientists argue they are the product of natural fracturing and erosion. Others see signs of deliberate shaping. The origin remains uncertain, but independent of the answer, these stone shapes have become symbols of something we know to be true. Entire coastlines have sunk, and with them whatever humans built along their edges. The Americas tell the same story in different forms. Along the Atlantic shelf, areas that were once dry land teemed with mammoths, mastodons, and the humans who hunted them. Off today's Florida coast, submerged sinkholes and caves hold human remains and artifacts from a time when sea level sat far lower. In South America, stretches of current coastline were once inland plains, slowly drowned by the same global rise. These drowned worlds were not just erased. Their disappearance redirected human history. When people were forced inland, they brought their knowledge, their seeds, their tools, and their stories. They joined or displaced other groups. New alliances formed. Old ways of life were reshaped. The lost coasts were not only taken away, they became the unseen starting point for new beginnings somewhere else. Yet the emotional impact of losing those coastlines is difficult to exaggerate. For many early cultures, land was not just property. It was sacred. It was where ancestors were buried, where rituals were held, where stories were anchored. To watch a burial ground disappear under the tide is to feel cut off, not only from home, but from the dead. Imagine standing on a new shoreline, knowing that beneath those waves lie the bones of your own grandparents, unreachable and silent. That sense of separation, a permanent submerging of what once felt eternal, must have shaped culture and identity in profound ways. We can still see its reflection in later legends of sunken homelands, drowned kingdoms, and ghostly bells tolling beneath the sea. And still, people endured. Where coastlines vanished, some became seafarers, learning to read the shape of waves, the flight of birds, the patterns of stars reflected on water. Others retreated inland, turning toward rivers and lakes, experimenting with new plants, new hunting grounds. In the Pacific, the encroaching ocean may have helped spark extraordinary traditions of open ocean navigation, as islanders mastered the art of crossing vast distances guided only by wind, stars, and swell. In that way, drowned coasts did not only take, they challenged, and in meeting that challenge, humans expanded what was possible. Today, scientists use sonar mapping, sediment cores, and underwater archaeology to reconstruct these sunken worlds. Sonar reveals ancient river channels etched into what is now seafloor. Cores taken from the bottom show layers of peat and soil evidence of old wetlands and forests. Fossils of land animals and plants lie buried beneath marine sediments, telling us exactly where shore once met sky. Every piece of that puzzle points to the same conclusion. What we consider sea has not always been sea. What we think of as fixed has always been in motion. Perhaps that's why drowned coastlines hold our imagination so strongly. They confront us with how fragile our own maps are. Today's edges of land and water feel permanent because they match our lifetime of experience. But to the earth, they are just one momentary sketch, destined to be redrawn. Picture yourself walking across one of those ancient plains 12,000 years ago. The air is cool but softening. Game animals graze along a broad horizon. Rivers meander lazily toward a distant, glittering sea. Your family forages, hunts, and builds simple shelters. The elders speak of spirits in the land and sky. Then as years pass, you begin to notice the sea is closer. A familiar grove now sits in brackish soil. A trail your grandparents loved disappears underwater. The world narrows, yet life goes on. That creeping impermanence becomes part of how you see everything. You teach your children not that the land is forever, but that it can change, even vanish. That lesson seeps into story, into ritual, into myth. Long after the plain itself is gone, the stories remain, carrying the memory of land you can no longer walk. Those drowned coastlines still exist, quiet under the waves, holding the outline of vanished rivers and ridges. We can only piece together their stories in fragments, bones here, tools there, a sonar image of an old valley. But together, they tell us that Earth's history is not a static backdrop. It is as fluid as the waters that cover those forgotten shores. When the ice sheets pulled back, they didn't only free water into the seas, they reshaped the very plumbing of the continents. The immense weight and scraping of the glaciers left behind hollows, basins, and deep scars. As the world warmed, meltwater and rainfall filled those depressions, creating new rivers and lakes where none had existed before. Earth after the Great Flood was not just a world of higher oceans. It became a world laced with fresh waterways, veins, and arteries of rivers and lakes that would carry life, sediment, and human history. North America offers some of the clearest examples. As ice retreated from what is now Canada and the northern United States, it left behind gigantic meltwater lakes. One of the largest, Lake Agassiz, sprawled across a vast area, so large it made today's Great Lakes look small. At its height, Lake Agassiz covered hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, a freshwater sea across the middle of a continent. To stand on its shore back then would have been to see a horizon of water as far as the eye could reach, with no sign that it was not an ocean. But lakes like Agassiz were unstable. Held in place by ice walls and fragile ridges of rock and debris, they were vulnerable to sudden failures. When an ice dam gave way, the lake could drain catastrophically. The resulting floods carved valleys, stripped soil, and sent torrents rushing across hundreds of miles. The Missoula floods in what is now the Pacific Northwest are one dramatic legacy. An enormous glacial lake once sat in western Montana behind an ice dam. Periodically, that dam failed, and a roaring wall of water loaded with ice and debris swept across what is now Washington State. It gouged out deep channels, left behind huge boulders, and carved dry waterfalls that still tower over the present-day landscape. Giant ripple marks, hundreds of feet apart, remain etched into the ground, like the fingerprint of a vanished flood. To people living anywhere near that kind of event, it would not have seemed like a river overflowing its banks. It would have felt like the world itself in motion. Elsewhere, as the ice withdrew, it hollowed out the basins that became the Great Lakes Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario. Over thousands of years, these basins filled with meltwater, and later, with rainfall and river flow. They turned into enormous freshwater reservoirs, feeding forests and wetlands, guiding animal migrations, and later becoming vital to human travel and trade. Imagine the first people arriving at the shores of those newborn lakes. Vast mirrors of sky, rich with fish, surrounded by young forests growing in fresh, mineral-rich soil. For them, these lakes were not just resources. They were new worlds to explore and depend on. Europe told a similar story in its own way. Scandinavia, once smothered by thick ice, transformed into a landscape of rivers, lakes, and deep inlets. Glacial valleys flooded with seawater to form the fjords of Norway. Countless smaller lakes dotted Finland and Sweden, earning Finland its nickname, Land of a Thousand Lakes. For the first people to move north as the ice retreated, these waters must have felt like gifts offering fish, transportation routes, and sheltering shores. In Siberia, enormous rivers like the Ob, Lena, and Yenisei swelled with meltwater, carving deeper channels toward the Arctic Ocean. In Central Asia, large inland lakes expanded, then shrank again as climate continued to shift. Their ancient shorelines are still visible as ghostly lines in today's deserts, reminders that what is now dry once held water. These new lakes and rivers didn't just alter the map, they restructured ecosystems. Wherever fresh water pooled or flowed, life gathered. Fish colonized new lakes. Birds followed, nesting in reeds and along muddy banks. Forests expanded along river corridors. Animals came to drink and graze. Humans soon followed, drawn by the same promise of food, water, and movement. Daily life rearranged itself around these waters. Herds migrated along river valleys. People set up campsites near lake shores, casting bone hooks or nets into the shallows. Over time, permanent or semi-permanent settlements grew in these fertile zones. The ripples of glacial retreat extended all the way into human culture. Imagine how disorienting this must have felt. A valley that had been a good hunting ground for one generation might become a lake by the next. A stream you could once step over might swell into a barrier. A region that had offered nothing but bare rock under ice could, within a few lifetimes, turn into a lush watershed full of animals and edible plants. The same waters that drowned coastlines were, inland, bringing new life. Some of the world's most important river systems were shaped or reshaped in this period. The Nile, fed in part by melt from African glaciers and highland rains, carved its course more deeply northward. Its floods laid down dark, fertile silt that would eventually feed one of the earliest great civilizations. In the Fertile Crescent, the Tigris and Euphrates became the lifelines of a region where farming would first flourish. In China, the Yellow River and the Yangtze carried sediments from newly exposed mountains and plateaus, building fertile floodplains that would later support dense human populations. Everywhere the ice retreated, water drew new lines on the land. Those lines became the stage on which the rest of human history would unfold. Human culture began to reflect this centrality of rivers and lakes. Settlements clustered along them. Trade moved with their currents. Rituals grew around them. In many early traditions, water was not just a thing. It was a being, a force, a boundary between worlds. The memory of the Great Flood was echoed on a smaller scale each spring when rivers swelled, lakes rose, and fields were either enriched or erased. For those who came after, lakes and rivers were blessings and risks at the same time. They fed crops, but could also wash them away. They carried fish, but also brought mosquitoes and disease. They connected communities, but also invited strangers. Living with water required vigilance and respect. For modern scientists, these lakes and rivers are like time capsules. Sediments at the bottom of a lake hold grains of pollen from plants that grew nearby, fragments of charcoal from ancient fires, traces of changing temperature and rainfall. Each core sample is a diary written in mud and silt, page after page, year after year, tracking what happened since the ice receded. Some of these water bodies were temporary. As climates continued to change, some lakes drained, others shrank, still others dried completely, leaving behind salt flats or empty basins. A few, like Lake Baikal in Siberia, or the Great Lakes in North America, endured as lasting features of the landscape. Their survival and their absence reminds us that nothing in nature is truly fixed. Not even the waters we think of as permanent. Picture yourself sitting beside one of those young lakes 12,000 years ago. The water is cold, its chill still echoing the glaciers it came from. The air is alive with insects and birds. Small plants are pushing up in soft, wet soil. A deer steps cautiously to the shoreline. Fish flash near the surface. The land feels raw, unfinished, but full of promise. That lake is more than just water. It is a symbol of the planet's recovery, of life returning after upheaval, of adaptation, not only for plants and animals, but for the people who will choose to live by its edge. And so, after the Great Flood, Earth became a world woven with lakes and rivers, new and old. They were not just lines on a map, but lifelines themselves, channels through which life, memory, and story would continue to flow. As the basins filled and rivers found their courses, something else began quietly spreading over the land. Where white ice had once stretched to the horizon, patches of green appeared small at first, then wider with each passing season. Mosses and lichens clung to bare rock. Grasses took hold in thin soil. Shrubs and then trees followed, unfolding into spaces that had been locked in ice for tens of thousands of years. The rebirth of forests and the sweep of new grasslands after the Great Melt was more than a change in scenery. It was the foundation of entirely new ecosystems that would shape life on Earth and human destiny for millennia. Imagine Northern Europe at the end of the Ice Age. For untold generations, glaciers had covered much of the region. Nothing grew on that frozen expanse. The weight of the ice pressed the land down into a low, cold silence. Then the ice began to retreat. Sunlight touched exposed ground again. Seeds carried by wind and birds, dormant for years or newly arrived from warmer regions, landed and sprouted. Grasses spread across valleys carved by ice. Birch trees, quick and hardy, took root. Pines followed. Oaks arrived later, bringing with them deep shade and a richer forest floor. What had been empty and white slowly turned into a mosaic of meadow and woodland. To the humans following the retreating ice northward, the land must have felt like a miracle. Ground that had once been sterile now offered wood, berries, nuts, and game. Across North America, a parallel transformation unfolded. Areas that had been tundra or glacial desert grew green. Grasslands advanced across the middle of the continent. In time, forests spread where climate and moisture allowed. Herds of animals followed the plants, mammoths and mastodons at first, then bison, horses, deer, and elk. Predators moved in their wake. Humans moved alongside, adjusting their hunting and gathering to match the changing mix of open plain and forested cover. Not every region became densely forested. Climate, rainfall, and soil each played their role. Some areas developed into thick woodlands, others remained open savannas or grasslands. Together, they created a diversity of habitats that hadn't been possible when ice smothered so much of the northern hemisphere. It was as if the planet, freed from its frozen shell, answered with an explosion of green. The spread of forests had deep effects on climate itself. Trees pull carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and release oxygen. As forests grew, they helped stabilize the climate that had been so volatile. They also changed regional weather. Forests recycle moisture, drawing it up from the ground and releasing it into the air, supporting clouds and rain. In many places, this feedback loop encouraged even more plant growth. In their quiet way, forests helped set the stage for the relatively stable climates humans would come to depend on. Grasslands played their part too. They might not stand as tall as a forest, but they supported immense herds of grazing animals. Those herds, in turn, fed predators and scavengers. For people, grasslands offered rich hunting grounds and open travel routes. Following herds across these plains, humans transported not just themselves but also their tools, stories, and ideas, linking distant regions together. Picture being among the first people to enter a valley that had recently lain beneath ice. The ground is tender and damp. Young trees stand in loose clusters. Birds flit from branch to branch. Insects buzz in warming air. Small mammals scurry between roots. The unnatural silence of the glacial landscape has been replaced by the layered sounds of a living world wind in leaves, wings, footsteps in underbrush. For people raised on sparse tundra or near the edges of ice, such places would have felt like abundance beyond anything their grandparents had known. These new landscapes shaped human culture as much as they shaped animal populations. In forests, people learned to track deer and wild boar instead of mammoth. They gathered nuts, fruits, and edible roots from the forest floor. They built more sheltered dwellings using wood. In grasslands, they refined group hunting tactics suited to chasing or trapping herds in open terrain. Different environments demanded different skills, and in meeting those demands, humans evolved diverse ways of living. Hunting in dense woods meant moving quietly, knowing animal trails, and reading subtle signs like broken twigs or disturbed leaves. Hunting on open plains meant stamina, coordination, and the ability to anticipate herd movement. These practical differences rippled outward into social patterns. Who hunted, how groups organized, when they moved, how they stored food. Forests also brought new kinds of danger. Thick cover made it easier for predators to ambush both animals and humans. Forest insects carried disease. At the same time, trees offered fuel and shelter that made cold nights bearable and storms less threatening. The forest was both protection and risk, friend and foe. Grasslands, by contrast, gave visibility but little cover. You could see far and be seen from far away. Open landscapes required vigilance and cooperation. They were both pathways and exposed stages. As people lived in closer contact with these reshaped environments, their spiritual and symbolic worlds changed as well. Trees became more than just wood. They turned into symbols of life, stability, and connection between earth and sky. Grasslands gave rise to stories of vastness, of herds and freedom, of endless horizons. The return of green was not only a physical recovery, it was a psychological and spiritual one too. After an age dominated by ice, color and growth carried a sense of hope. Archaeology and paleoecology now confirm this broad picture. Tiny grains of pollen preserved in lake mud show which plants were present century by century. Charcoal fragments tell us when and where people used fire to clear land or shape vegetation. Animal bones reveal changes in hunting and diet. Together, these traces show not just that landscapes were changing, but that humans were actively participating in and reacting to those changes. Forests and grasslands also laid the groundwork for what would eventually become agriculture. As people gathered wild grains in open country and fruits and nuts in wooded areas, they learned which plants were most useful, which seeds stored well, which patches of ground yielded best. Over long periods, they began to experiment sowing seeds, tending plants, returning to the same spots year after year. Without the expansion of these rich green environments after the flood, the shift to farming would have had very little soil, literally and figuratively, in which to take root. Imagine walking through one of those early post-glacial forests. The trees are younger and thinner than the towering stands we might picture today. Light comes down in scattered shafts. Ferns and small shrubs fill the gaps. Animal tracks crisscross the leaf litter. If you step out from the trees, you emerge into a breath of grassland grass, swaying like waves under the wind, dotted with grazing animals on the horizon. Between forest and grass, you stand in the middle of a planet being remade. That was Earth's gift after the waters. It didn't only take, it gave back in the form of living, breathing landscapes, new habitats that would sustain not just animals and plants, but the entire arc of human development to come. But the end of the Ice Age was not gentle to every creature. As warmth returned and ecosystems reorganized, not all species could keep up. The period after the Great Flood was not just a time of renewal, it was also a time of farewell. Many of the great animals that had defined the Ice Age began to disappear. For thousands of years, mammoths had roamed the tundra and steppe shaggy giants with sweeping tusks, perfectly suited to a cold, grassy world. They thrived where open, wind-blown plains provided the tough grasses and sedges they needed. As forests encroached and the open steppe shrank, their food base dwindled. Warmer climates brought new diseases and competitors. At the same time, human hunting pressure increased. People had long relied on mammoths for meat, hides, and bone. As mammoth habitats shrank, they became more vulnerable to overhunting. Little by little, their range contracted. Eventually, mammoths vanished from most of their former territories. A few small populations survived for some time on isolated Arctic islands, but even they eventually disappeared. All that remained were bones buried in permafrost, frozen carcasses with flesh and hair still intact, and the faint echoes of stories humans may have told about the great beasts that once walked the earth. Mastodons, close relatives of mammoths with different diets and habits, followed a similar path. They had thrived in North America's forests, browsing on leaves and twigs rather than grazing open plains. But as climates shifted and forests changed composition, mastodon populations declined. Human hunters added another layer of stress. By around 10,000 years ago, mastodons were gone from the continent. For the humans who had shared the land with such animals, who depicted them in art and depended on them for survival, their absence must have been bewildering. Imagine children hearing about massive beasts they would never see, trying to picture them from the words of elders or the lines on stone. They were not the only ones to go. Giant ground sloths, some as big as elephants, once moved slowly through South American forests and plains, tearing at vegetation with huge claws. Saber-toothed cats, with their long, curved canine teeth, had hunted large prey across multiple continents. Dire wolves, bigger and more heavily built than modern wolves, stalked the same lands. North America had its own native camels and horses. Giant beavers lived along rivers and lakes. One by one, or in waves, these giants disappeared at the close of the Pleistocene. The causes remain a subject of scientific debate. Climate change reshaped vegetation and habitats at a speed many species couldn't match. Human hunting and habitat disturbance added further pressure. Some animals might have survived one of these challenges alone, but not both. For humans, these extinctions were double-edged. On one side, they meant the loss of major food sources and familiar presences in the landscape. On the other, they forced people to diversify and adapt their diets and strategies. With fewer giant animals available, humans turned more to smaller game, fish, birds, and plants. In some regions, this shift in diet and resource use may have been one of the pressures that nudged populations toward early agriculture and more intensive plant use. So, in a sense, the disappearance of Ice Age megafauna helped open the door for the new human ways of living that would follow. Not all large animals vanished, of course. Many species survived by being flexible. Bison adapted to new grasslands in smaller but still vast herds. Deer, elk, and moose found niches in the mosaics of forest and meadow. Wolves persisted by switching prey and living in adaptable packs. Bears made use of both forests and open areas, shifting diets with seasons. Their survival hinged on versatility, on being able to change what they ate, where they ranged, and how they lived. This, too, mirrored the human story. Picture standing on a plain where mammoths once roamed, now empty of giants. The quiet itself would feel like a presence. Children might ask why the great animals no longer came. Elders might answer with stories of changing seasons, of diminishing herds, of hunts that once were and are no more. Over time, those stories might shift, turning into tales of strange creatures from an earlier age, half remembered and transformed into legend. The loss of these animals changed ecosystems. Without mammoths and mastodons to push over trees and churn up ground, some forests likely grew denser. Without giant grazers to trim grasses and keep shrubs at bay, some grasslands thickened with woody plants. The disappearance of apex predators and huge herbivores reshaped the entire balance of life. The survivors, both animal and human, had to find their way in this newly quieted world. For scientists today, the bones and fossils of these vanished creatures speak as clearly as any story. Frozen mammoths in Siberian permafrost still hold a snapshot of their last meals in their stomachs. Cave paintings show mammoths, bison, and wild horses rendered with astonishing accuracy, proof that our ancestors knew these animals intimately. Fossil trackways preserve the footprints of herds moving across soft ground now turned to stone. Through these remnants, we can almost see both the presence and the absence, the world that once was, and the one that took its place. The end of the Ice Age was thus not a smooth slide into our current conditions. It was a turbulent crossing, full of setbacks and transformations, extinctions and survivals. Yet in that tension, life found new forms, new balances. The giants of the Cold Age disappeared. The survivors, including us, stepped into a future no one could yet imagine. As waters rose and ice shrank back toward the poles, it wasn't only animals and landscapes that had to adapt. Humanity itself stood at a threshold. People who had grown up in a world shaped by ice and cold suddenly faced a planet that was warmer, wetter, less predictable, and filled with environments their ancestors had never seen. The deluge did not erase humanity, but it did force a rethinking of almost everything. Where to live, what to eat, how to travel, how to understand the power shaping their world. It's important to be clear about who these people were. They were not primitive in the way that word is sometimes used. By the time the great floods transformed their lands, humans were already skilled with stone, bone, and wood. They painted vivid scenes on cave walls. They carved figurines and ornaments. They had complex languages and rich oral traditions. They knew how to manage fire, how to cooperate in large hunts, how to craft clothing and shelter against biting cold. They had survived the height of the last ice age. They were not fragile. As seas advanced and coastlines shifted, these people had a choice only in how they adapted, not in whether they would. The rising oceans reshaped migration routes. Land bridges that had once tied regions together were gone. Plains that had been easy passages turned into bays and straits. Populations that had been in contact for generations suddenly found themselves divided by water. In Eurasia, the flooding of Doggerland separated Britain from the mainland. In Southeast Asia, the drowning of Sunderland split a once continuous landmass into a scattering of islands. In the Americas, advancing coasts erased lowland hunting grounds, pushing people toward higher ground or new inland routes. Some groups moved away from the changing shores, following rivers deeper into continents or settling along newly formed lakes. Others turned toward the water itself, learning to live with and from the expanding seas. They gathered shellfish along tidal flats, learned the patterns of fish migrations, and experimented with rafts, dugout canoes, or simple boats. The flood, in that sense, was not only a destructive force, it was also a teacher. Food lay at the center of this transformation. Many of the great animals that had sustained humans through the Ice Age were gone or dwindling. Mammoths, Mastodons, giant sloths, and other massive creatures had either vanished or become rare and scattered. People had to turn more and more to smaller game deer, antelope, rabbits, birds, to fish and shellfish, and to plants, seeds, tubers, fruits, nuts. Gathering, which had always been part of the human survival strategy, became even more important. In some regions, this deepening reliance on plant foods laid the groundwork for something entirely new, the deliberate planting and tending of those plants. At the same time, people began to use fire more actively to shape their landscapes. They burned patches of forest to encourage the growth of certain edible plants, or to create clearings that drew grazing animals. In doing so, they were taking the first steps from living within ecosystems to managing them, gently, at first, but decisively. After the flood, humans were not only reacting to environmental change, they were beginning to change their environments in return. Social life changed too. Flooded lands and shifting resources meant movement. Groups that had long occupied the same regions were displaced or compressed into smaller areas. Some merged with neighbors, others competed. Both conflict and cooperation left their marks. New technologies and ideas spread where people met. Stone tool styles, fishing techniques, and, in time, early plant tending practices traveled along rivers and coasts as families intermarried and groups shared or borrowed what worked. In this way, the aftermath of the flood was an engine for cultural exchange. The loss of land pushed people into new patterns of connection. Spiritual life adapted alongside everything else. The memory of rising waters, drowned homes, and vanished animals needed an explanation. Flood myths, with their themes of divine judgment, cleansing, and renewal, likely took shape in part as people tried to understand what had happened and why. These stories were more than explanations. They were frameworks for living. They taught that the world could be swept away, but that survival was possible. They offered models of wisdom, the one who listens to the warning, who builds the boat, and warnings about arrogance or neglect. Above all, they encoded the idea that after destruction, rebuilding is possible. Imagine a small community gathered around a fire at the edge of a new lake created by glacial melt. An elder tells of the valley that once stretched where the water now stands, of animals that used to roam there, now gone, of rivers that run wider than before. Children, who have only ever known the lake, learn from that story that the land can change, and with it, their lives. In that circle of storytelling, both memory and adaptation are passed on. Technology, in its quiet way, marched forward. In many places, people developed better fishing tools, barbed bone hooks, woven nets, fish traps along riverbanks. Watercraft improved. Simple rafts might evolve into more stable dugouts or boats capable of carrying larger loads. The bow and arrow began to appear and spread, making it easier to hunt smaller, faster animals efficiently and at a distance. Grinding stones for processing seeds and nuts into flour became more common. Pottery emerged in some regions as people needed containers to store gathered or processed foods, especially as diets leaned more heavily on plants and fish that benefited from cooking and storage. Each of these innovations was a response to a world in flux. Archaeological sites give us glimpses of these transformations. In the Fertile Crescent, evidence of early cultivation appears not long after the climatic swings of the Younger Dryas, suggesting that unstable food supplies pushed people to experiment with growing their own. In Japan, the Jomon people crafted some of the world's earliest pottery, likely for cooking and storing a varied diet rich in seafood and wild plants. In the Americas, sites show a shift away from specialized big game hunting toward broader use of smaller animals, seeds, and roots. Patterns differ from place to place, but a common thread runs through them all. People adjusted. And it wasn't only a matter of survival in the narrow sense. Out of these adjustments, new forms of flourishing emerged. As certain regions became more stable and productive, communities could settle more firmly. Instead of constantly moving after herds, some groups began returning to the same places season after season, then year after year, building more permanent shelters and, eventually, villages. The seeds of farming, of settled life, of what we call civilization, were planted in the soil of post-flood adaptation. Yet even as some communities rooted themselves, the memory of rising waters did not vanish. Flood stories remained, passed on through generations. Rituals to rivers and seas persisted. Many early cultures treated the boundary between land and water with particular respect as a place of power, of crossing, of risk. Not everyone chose, or was able, to settle, even where farming appeared. For thousands of years, hunters and gatherers, fishers and foragers, and early farmers coexisted. Some traded with each other, others competed for territory. Different lifeways overlapped and interacted, each one a valid response to particular environments and histories. This diversity was a strength. It meant that humanity as a whole was not locked into a single way of living, but exploring many. The flood also made humans more mobile in a deeper sense. As lowlands drowned, people followed rivers and coasts into lands they had never seen. They crossed newly opened passes where ice had melted. They sailed to islands that had once been hills in a larger landscape. In the process, they spread further across the globe, reaching nearly every habitable region. Throughout it all, one thing remained constant: the need for meaning and beauty. Even in times of displacement, people decorated tools, made music, adorned themselves with beads and pigments. They painted, carved, and sang. In doing so, they asserted that life was more than bare survival. The flood may have disrupted their world, but it did not wash away what made them human. In the end, humanity after the deluge was both exposed and strong. Exposed to forces beyond control, shifting seas, vanishing animals, uncertain seasons. Strong in the capacity to observe, to cooperate, to create, to adapt. Out of that balance came everything that followed: fields and villages, cities and stories, the long road that leads from those ancient coasts to the present moment in which you and I share this tale. The waters did not end the story. They turned the page. When oceans advanced and rivers overflowed their banks, they did more than reshape the land. They reshaped memory. People do not simply shrug and forget when floods take their homes, their graves, their sacred places. They carry those experiences with them in the only vessels that can survive displacement: stories, songs, rituals, and symbols. Over time, those living memories turn into traditions, into myths, into teachings passed down not as distant history, but as living guidance. The great flood that followed the Ice Age was remembered in exactly this way. Across Mesopotamia, one of humanity's earliest heartlands of settlement, the memory of flood became foundational. Long before the story of Noah spread widely, the Epic of Gilgamesh told of Utnapishtim, a man forewarned by the gods that a deluge would wipe out life. He builds a great boat, fills it with his family and animals, survives the waters, and finds himself in a remade world. This tale, pressed into clay tablets, almost certainly reaches back into older oral tradition stories first told by people living along rivers that flooded unpredictably and plains that had once been sea. It preserves a sense that the world was once reset by water. In India, the legend of Manu and the fish carries similar themes. A small fish warns Manu of a coming flood and asks to be protected. In return, when the waters rise, the fish, an incarnation of the god, Vishnu tows Manu's boat to safety. Manu has gathered seeds of all things, and, after the flood, these seeds become the source of renewed life. The story encodes practical wisdom: save seeds, protect diversity, inside spiritual narrative. It acknowledges that floods destroy, while also insisting that life can be preserved and replanted. Greek tradition offers the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha. Warned that Zeus intends to flood the world, they build a chest and survive the rising waters. When they emerge onto dry land, they repopulate the world by throwing stones behind them which turn into people. Again, we see destruction, survival, and renewal braided together. Across the Atlantic, indigenous peoples carried their own deep flood memories. The Hopi tell of earlier worlds destroyed because people fell out of balance, one of them by water. Survivors are guided through sacred openings to a new world when the flood recedes. The Ojibwe tell of a flood covering the earth, and of animals diving into the depths to bring up mud so that a new land can be formed. In some versions, a small, humble animal succeeds where larger, more powerful ones fail. These stories teach not only about catastrophe, but about cooperation, humility, and persistence. In Mesoamerica, some Maya traditions speak of earlier creations destroyed by flood before the current world was formed. In the Pacific, among many island cultures, there are tales of sinking homelands, of canoes bearing survivors to new shores, of gods lifting chosen people above the rising sea. Even in Northern Europe, echoes remain. Norse myth describes cycles of destruction and rebirth involving seas and floods. Later folk traditions across Europe tell of drowned towns whose bells still ring beneath the waves, of valleys once dry now filled with lakes created by a single rash act or broken pact. Set side by side, these stories are varied in detail yet unified in rhythm. A world overwhelmed, a warning, sometimes heeded, sometimes not, a vessel or refuge, survival, and a new beginning. They are not identical, but they share a pattern that is hard to ignore. We might be tempted to see them purely as products of imagination. But when such similar structures appear in cultures separated by oceans, and when their central image overwhelming water matches known global events, it becomes easier to see them as cultural memories, shaped and reshaped, but rooted in lived experience. Oral traditions are capable of preserving such memories far beyond what we once thought. In Australia, Aboriginal stories describe coastlines and islands now underwater, in some cases accurately matching features that were drowned around 7,000 or more years ago. These stories have passed from person to person, generation to generation, for countless centuries without being written down. If those memories can endure, then it's not a stretch to imagine that flood myths from other parts of the world likewise carry echoes of ancient inundations. Myth does not report events the way a modern historian might. Instead, it transforms events into lessons. A flood is not only a surge of water, it becomes judgment, cleansing, renewal. Survivors are not only lucky, they are righteous, wise, or specially chosen. The narrative makes sense of senseless upheaval. Why did the waters come? Why did the world change? For people living without the tools of modern science, such questions found their answers in divine will, cosmic cycles, or moral causes. These explanations may not satisfy a geologist, but they served an essential function. They helped people live with what had happened. What's remarkable is how often the moral core of flood myths lines up with practical survival lessons. Many emphasize listening to warnings, whether from gods, spirits, animals, or keen observers of nature. Those who pay attention, who are humble enough to act, live. Those who ignore the signs do not. In real terms, those who noticed when rivers behaved differently, when tides rose higher, when unusual storms came, had better chances to prepare and survive. The stories embed that lesson so it can be carried forward even when the original circumstances are long gone. Flood myths also insist on renewal. The waters recede, seeds sprout, animals are released, land is rediscovered or remade, humans begin again. This is more than optimism. It reflects the truth that people did survive, did rebuild, did manage to carve new lives on new shores. For us today, these stories are more than curiosities from the distant past. They are bridges between human experience and Earth's long rhythms. They remind us that we have faced world-changing water before, that we learned from it, that we turned memory into guidance, and they remind us that even when the world feels like it is drowning, there is a path narrow, difficult, but real toward renewal. While the great meltwater seas were rising and cultures were weaving floods into story, the climate itself played a more complicated game than a simple slide from cold to warm. Just as the planet seemed to be settling into a new, gentler phase, it lurched. This abrupt cold snap is known to science as the Younger Dryas. For a brief but intense time on, the order of 1,000 years, the world partially slipped back toward Ice Age conditions. Glaciers halted their retreat, and in some areas began to advance again. Temperatures in parts of the northern hemisphere dropped dramatically, What had looked like a steady path toward warmth turned into a jagged, unsettling detour. Imagine living in Europe or North America around 12,800 years ago. You have grown up hearing that the ice is withdrawing. Rivers are stronger with meltwater. Plants and animals are tentatively reclaiming ground. The direction of change seems clear. Then, within a single lifetime, the seasons cool. Winters lengthen and harden. Summers feel brief and weak. Forests that were spreading slow their advance or thin out. Tundra plants push southward again. Herds that had returned disappear or decline. For those who had begun to trust the promise of a greener world, this reversal would have been deeply disorienting. Scientists are still working to understand what triggered the Younger Dryas. One leading idea points to a massive pulse of fresh water pouring into the North Atlantic when a huge glacial lake, often associated with Lake Agassiz or similar bodies, suddenly drained. That much fresh water could have disrupted ocean circulation, weakening the currents that carry warm water northward. Without that warmth, large regions cooled abruptly. Other hypotheses suggest a comet or asteroid impact that started widespread fires, filling the air with light-blocking particles. Still others point to volcanic activity or complex feedbacks within the climate system itself. Whatever the exact cause, the effect is visible in ice cores and sediments. A sharp downturn in temperatures and a return to dustier, colder conditions across much of the northern hemisphere. The consequences reached far beyond the polar regions. In Europe, temperatures may have dropped by up to 10 degrees Celsius in a matter of decades. In the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent, where people were intensively gathering wild grains, grew drier. In North America, ice sheets that had been rapidly shrinking stabilized or even regrew slightly. Plants and animals that had been marching steadily into new territories were suddenly pushed back or forced to adapt once again. For humans, the Younger Dryas was another hard test. In the Levant, communities of hunter-gatherers known to archaeologists as the Natufians had been experimenting with a semi-sedentary lifestyle, relying heavily on wild cereals. As the climate turned colder and drier, their once reliable food sources became patchy. Some groups went back to more mobile ways of life. Others doubled down on managing plants more directly, tending stands of grain, replanting seeds, protecting them. Pressure and scarcity may have nudged some of these communities from gathering toward true cultivation. In that sense, the Younger Dryas may have been one of the catalysts that pushed humanity further along the path to farming. A climate setback helped give rise to a new way of life. Elsewhere, people leaned on older skills. Hunters in colder regions focused again on animals adapted to harsh conditions: reindeer, bison, smaller game. Fishing provided a buffer where rivers and lakes remained productive. Fire remained essential, not just for warmth, but for manipulating landscapes in ways that might favor certain plants or animals. Communities likely became more mobile again, zigzagging with the shifting edges of habitable zones. The emotional weight of such a reversal is hard to overstate. To live through change is one thing. To live through change that promises relief, only to be thrown back into hardship, is another. In many later myths, we see cycles of worlds destroyed and remade, ages of prosperity followed by punishment, and then a new beginning. Some of that narrative shape may echo what it felt like to pass through the Younger Dryas: hope, setback, and eventual renewal. Archaeological evidence supports the idea of disruption. In some regions, settlement patterns shift, tool traditions change, and evidence of stressed dietary shifts, increased mobility, new survival strategies appears. In other areas, people seem to hang on by refining what already worked, squeezing resilience out of familiar methods. What makes the Younger Dryas especially striking is its speed. Many climate shifts unfold slowly over thousands of years. This one unfolded within decades. People living through it would have noticed. Rivers freezing longer, snows lingering, plants failing to sprout when and where expected. It would have felt personal, not distant. Eventually, just as abruptly as it began, the Younger Dryas ended. Around 11,600 years ago, temperatures rose sharply again. Glaciers resumed their retreat. Forests advanced once more. The Holocene, our current, relatively stable warm period, began in earnest. This time, The warmth stayed. Sea levels continued to rise, but the wild oscillations of the late Ice Age gave way to more consistent patterns. The climate, while far from perfectly steady, became stable enough to allow long-term planting crops, building permanent villages, developing complex cultures. The memory of that cold return, however, likely lingered in stories and attitudes toward the environment. It was another reminder that the Earth's moods could swing quickly, that even when things seemed settled, change could arrive without much warning. The Younger Dryas teaches us that resilience is not just about adapting once. It's about adapting again and again when the world keeps shifting beneath your feet. Out of that jagged path came something remarkable. As the planet warmed for the second time and remained warm, the conditions were finally in place for a more revolutionary transformation of human life, the birth of agriculture. When the chill of the Younger Dryas finally relaxed and climate steadied, the world that emerged was ripe for something new. Forests and grasslands were established, rivers and lakes had found more stable courses. The great post-glacial floods had done their carving and begun to calm. In many regions, the land, newly enriched with sediments and nutrients, was ready to grow. Humans, too, were ready. For countless generations, people had lived by hunting and gathering, moving with herds and seasons. They knew plants intimately when they sprouted, where they grew best, which seeds were most nourishing, which roots stored well, which berries could be dangerous. Sometime in this period following the great floods and the Younger Dryas, scattered experiments began to solidify into a different way of being. We can imagine how it may have started. A camp beside a patch of wild grain. People notice that where seeds fall, new plants grow the next season. Perhaps they burn a section of ground and see that afterward, edible plants return thicker and more vigorous. They begin to scatter seeds intentionally, to pull weeds, to guard the area from animals. Over years and centuries, trial and error accumulates into knowledge. The Fertile Crescent stretching through parts of modern-day Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and beyond was one of the earliest known centers of this shift. There, wild ancestors of wheat, barley, and lentils grew in abundance along river valleys and hillsides. As people tended these plants, some seeds with slight natural differences, tougher grains, non-shattering seed heads, better yields, were unintentionally favored and replanted. Through human hands, wild plants slowly turned into domesticated crops. At the same time, relationships with animals changed. Dogs had already been with humans for thousands of years, partners in hunting and protection. Now sheep and goats, once wild in mountain and rocky regions, began to be tamed. They offered meat, milk, hides, and in time, wool. Later came cattle from wild oryx, then pigs. Each partnership deepened humanity's ability to buffer against scarcity. For early people, these innovations did not feel like inventing agriculture. They were simply trying to survive more reliably in a changing world. Hunting alone, especially after the extinction of big game, was risky. Gathering alone left people at the mercy of unpredictable wild harvests. Farming and herding offered something new, a way to coax a more dependable supply from the land. With the ability to store surplus grain and maintain herds, communities could support more people in one place for longer periods. Seasonal camps began to turn into true villages. People built sturdier houses, dug storage pits, shaped clay into pots to hold grain and liquids. The rhythm of the year shifted. Instead of being defined only by migrations of herds or the ripening of scattered wild plants, time became organized around cycles of sowing and harvest. People had to think months ahead, imagining a future harvest while planting in the present. That kind of long-range planning, while not entirely new, became central. The psychological shift was enormous. With farming, there was a promise, never absolute but powerful, that if you worked the land well, it would give back. Of course, agriculture came with its own risks. Crops could fail from drought, flood, pests, or disease. Herds could be hit by illness. A bad year could still mean hunger. But over the long run, in many places, the benefits outweighed the dangers. Populations grew where farming flourished. Villages expanded. Social structures became more complex. Farming did not appear in only one place. While the Fertile Crescent is one of the earliest and best-known regions, other centers emerged independently. In China, people began tending millet and rice. In the Americas, maize, beans, and squash were domesticated. In parts of Africa, sorghum, yams, and other crops took on central roles. Each region worked with the plants and animals available to it, arriving at its own version of agriculture. What they all shared was a common realization: humans could shape the earth to feed them. With more reliable food came opportunities for specialization. Some people could spend more time on pottery, weaving, tool-making, or ritual. Leadership structures emerged to organize labor and manage surplus. Rituals focused on fertility of fields and herds. The first hints of formal religion, politics, and complex social hierarchies appeared in tandem with cultivated fields. Farming also deepened humanity's impact on the landscape. Forests were cleared to make way for fields. Wetlands were drained. Waterways were diverted for simple irrigation. Over time, these actions would transform habitats on a scale even the great floods had not. At first, though, it was simply a strategy for living to push back against uncertainty, and, in doing so, to tie human fate more closely than ever to the soil. Not everyone followed this path. Many groups continued hunting, gathering, and fishing for thousands of years, even while farming villages grew nearby. Sometimes they traded meat and furs for grains and tools. Sometimes they clashed over territory. Sometimes they lived side by side in a shifting balance. Humanity did not flip from wild to settled all at once. It experimented across a spectrum of possibilities. For archaeologists, the remains of early farming communities tell rich stories. Grinding stones polished smooth by years of use, charred seeds in ancient hearths, post holes outlining houses, clay jars decorated with simple patterns. They show people putting down roots in a literal and symbolic sense, structuring their lives around particular patches of land. We can picture a small early village at the edge of a river. Low houses made of mud brick or wood, fields stretching nearby, dotted with grains pushing up from the soil, goats or sheep grazing close to the settlement, children scattering seeds or helping carry water, adults repairing tools, tending animals, planning the next season's planting. In the evenings, fires burn. Stories are told of the floods that once drowned other lands, of ancestors who walked far to find this place, of spirits or gods who bless or withhold the harvest. The old memory of water is still present, now woven into prayers for rain or pleas to keep the rivers within their banks. The Great Flood and its long aftermath did not just change where people lived, it changed what was possible for them. The same upheavals that forced humanity to adapt also created the conditions for farming, settlement, and eventually the rise of cities and civilizations. Without the waters, without the ice, without the forests and grasslands that followed, our story would be unrecognizable. As the climate steadied and fields took shape, another transformation was unfolding all around. The return and reshaping of animal life in a world no longer ruled by ice, where mammoths, saber-toothed cats, and giant ground sloths had disappeared. Other animals stepped into the spaces they left behind. Some species were new arrivals in recently thawed regions. Others had long existed further south and simply expanded north as conditions allowed. Together, they helped build the ecosystems we recognize today. Picture the northern plains of Europe or North America just after the ice had finally retreated. The land is a patchwork of fresh grasslands and young forests. Into this landscape move herds of deer, elk, and bison, spreading quickly across open ground. Wolves pad along behind them, hunting in packs. Beavers move into rivers and streams, felling saplings and building dams that slow water and create ponds. Birds return in numbers, waterfowl along new lakes, songbirds in emerging woods, raptors riding thermals over meadows. The silence that ice once imposed cracks and falls away under the noise of life returning. The disappearance of the megafauna had left ecological jobs unfilled. Without giant grazers, smaller herbivores flourished. Without huge predators, wolves, bears, and smaller cats became the main hunters. Rabbits and hares multiplied in the grasses, feeding foxes and birds of prey. Insects, so easily overlooked, expanded into new niches, pollinating flowers, breaking down plant matter, and becoming food for countless other creatures. Animals are not passive occupants of the land. They are engineers. As they returned, they reshaped the world in ways as profound, if more subtle, than those of ice and water. Consider beavers. By damming streams, they turned narrow channels into sprawling wetlands. These wetlands became nurseries for fish, amphibians, and aquatic plants. They attracted birds and mammals. Over time, they built rich, layered ecosystems that filtered water and stored carbon. Without beavers, many valleys would have held only single-thread streams. With them, the land became mottled with ponds and marshes, teeming with life. Or think of grazing animals: bison, deer, antelope. Their browsing and trampling kept some grasslands open, preventing trees from reclaiming every spare patch. They helped maintain a mosaic landscape of forest, shrubland, and open field. Predators, in turn, kept these herds from overrunning their environments, maintaining balance. Humans navigated this shifting web of life as both participant and shaper. For them, the return of animals meant food, tools, clothing, and competition. Deer, elk, and boar provided meat and hides. Fish filled lakes and rivers. Birds and their eggs were prized sources of protein. But wolves, bears, and other predators remained dangerous neighbors. They hunted the same prey, and sometimes hunted people or their newly domesticated animals as well. The relationships between humans and animals in this period were complex and layered. Some species were hunted relentlessly, others were respected or even revered. Some, like dogs, were drawn into deep partnership. Goats and sheep, once wild, gradually found places in human camps as living stores of meat, milk, and fiber. Cattle and pigs would follow later, further blurring the boundary between animal and ally. These partnerships evolved slowly, shaped by necessity and curiosity. Humans noticed which animals were easiest to manage, which could thrive on scraps or marginal land, which provided the most in return for care. The animals that joined us did so, in a way, as survivors to adapting to a life intertwined with ours. As animals repopulated landscapes, they also shaped how people understood the world in a spiritual sense. In stories and rituals, animals appeared as teachers, guides, guardians, or even kin. The return of deer to forests, or the annual journeys of salmon upstream, were not only observed, but honored. The behavior of animals became part of calendars, omens, and sacred narratives. Imagine standing at the edge of a river newly carved by glacial melt, watching salmon or other fish fight their way upstream. For people whose lives depended increasingly on such runs, this yearly return could feel miraculous, a promise renewed. They might frame it in story as a gift from spirit beings or river gods, embedding gratitude and respect in the very act of fishing. Over time, the combined effect of plant growth and animal return transformed once barren terrain into some of the most diverse ecosystems on Earth. The Amazon basin, fed by meltwater and rainfall patterns influenced by post-Ice Age climate shifts, unfolded into the dense, layered forest we know today. North American prairies grew into vast seas of grass humming with insect life and roamed by herds. European woodlands filled with wild boar, wolves, bears, deer, and an orchestra of birds. Human movement adjusted accordingly. Hunters followed migration routes. Families timed their travels to match the presence of certain animals in certain places. People learned when herds would pass through a valley, when birds would arrive at wetlands, when fish would crowd certain narrows. This knowledge became part of cultural inheritance, taught across generations as carefully as tool-making or storytelling. Archaeological evidence reflects this close relationship. Bones in ancient camps testify to what people ate, where marks on tools show how they processed hides, meat, and bone. Carvings on antler or ivory depict deer, birds, fish, and other animals with remarkable sensitivity. Cave paintings from earlier Ice Age times carry forward into rock art and sculptures in later periods, keeping animals at the center of visual imagination. Humans were not outside these ecosystems, looking in. They were inside them, dependent on them, affecting and affected by them. It's worth pausing to imagine how this world felt, moment to moment. To stand in a clearing at dawn and hear the layered chorus of birds, distant calls of animals, the rustle of something moving in the understory. To walk along a muddy path and see tracks human, deer, wolf, boar intersecting and overlapping. To recognize that your path is just one among many, all sharing the same water, the same vegetation, the same hazards. The return of animals after the flood made the world feel alive in a way glacial landscapes never could. Yet there was also fragility in that vibrancy. People still remembered, directly or through story, that animals could vanish, that mammoths and other giants had done so, that abundance was not a given. That awareness may have shaped practices of hunting, ritual, and respect in ways we only dimly understand now. Many of the patterns set in this post-flood world still echo around us. The migration routes animals follow, the breeding grounds birds return to, the ranges of predators and prey. Many of these have their roots in the landscapes carved by ice and flood, and in the opportunities and barriers created as waters rose and fell. And through it all, people moved alongside animals, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in conflict, but always in relationship. The flood had reset the stage, but the play went on. While most of the human story after the Great Flood unfolded on newly stable land, part of that story slipped underwater and out of sight. As sea levels climbed, they did not just nibble at the edges of continents. They swallowed whole coasts, river valleys, and low basins where people had lived, hunted, and gathered for generations. Those communities left few traces on land because the land itself vanished. What remains of them now lies on seafloors and beneath layers of sediment fragments of civilizations by the shore, drowned but not entirely erased. We've already met Doggerland beneath the North Sea and the broader sweep of Sunderland in Southeast Asia. But these are only two examples in a global pattern. In the Mediterranean, for instance, many ancient coastal settlements now lie underwater, though most date from times well after the Great Ice Age floods. Their presence, however, reminds us that the Mediterranean's coastline, like all coastlines, is not fixed. Earthquakes, subsidence, and rising sea levels have repeatedly redrawn it. Deeper still, beyond most human memory, older drowned landscapes wait to be found or remain forever hidden. In the Black Sea region, some researchers have proposed that a relatively sudden inflow of Mediterranean water around 7,000 to 8,000 years ago dramatically expanded the sea and flooded low-lying areas where people lived. The details are still debated, but the idea that inland basins could fill rapidly and drown communities ties into the broader reality of post-glacial sea level rise. In the Indian Ocean, the continental shelves off India and Sri Lanka show signs of ancient river channels and floodplains now submerged. In some places, sonar has mapped what appear to be old shorelines and terraces features that would have marked the edges of land when sea level was much lower. Along these drowned coasts, people once fished in rivers and built seasonal camps that are now out of reach beneath tens of meters of water. Across the Pacific, from the coasts of China and Korea to Japan and the islands of Polynesia and Micronesia, similar stories are implied by the shape of submerged landscapes. What is now a scattering of islands was often once connected land. People living along those ancient coasts had to move as the ocean rose, carrying their knowledge, tools, and beliefs with them. We cannot easily know the details of life in those drowned settlements, but we can infer some things. They were likely small mobile communities, anchored to rich estuaries and river mouths where freshwater and saltwater met. They would have harvested fish and shellfish, trapped birds, gathered plants, and hunted inland. Their seasonal patterns would have followed tides, spawning runs, and river levels. Their sacred sites may have clustered along high points or special rock formations near the water. As the sea advanced, these places would have been lost one by one. First, a favorite shellfish bed becomes too deep to reach easily. Then a camp that used to sit safely above storms finds itself regularly flooded. A burial site, once on firm, dry soil, becomes unreachable. Finally, only currents move where ancestors once walked. It's tempting to imagine advanced, lost cities in these drowned regions, grand structures and complex societies wiped clean by the sea. While no solid evidence supports such visions on the scale of later civilizations, it is entirely reasonable to think that some of the earliest, more settled or socially intricate communities may have formed along coasts that are now underwater. Rich estuaries and sheltered bays would have been natural places for experimentation with longer-term settlement and more intensive food use. If some of those early experiments in community organization, ritual, or rudimentary trade took place there, then rising seas may quite literally have buried some of our earliest chapters beneath the waves. The story of Atlantis, as recorded by Plato, captures this idea in symbolic form: a great island society swallowed by the sea. Whether or not it has any basis in specific events, it resonates because it reflects something people already knew: that the ocean can take away whole worlds. Modern science is slowly peeling back small pieces of that submerged past. Sonar mapping reveals drowned river valleys and ancient shorelines on continental shelves. Underwater archaeology, though difficult and expensive, has found tools, bones, and even remains of simple structures off present-day coasts. Each discovery confirms that what is now seabed once carried human footprints. When we think about those lost coastal peoples, it's important to remember that their disappearance was not absolute. The people moved. The places did not. Those who survived carried their stories inland to new settlements upstream or upslope. They likely told their children about the drowned villages. They folded those memories into myths of floods, of gods, of spirits of the sea. The land was gone, but the lessons remained in cautionary tales, in ritual offerings to the water, in careful attention to where and how new settlements were built. Even now, the idea of sunken worlds stirs something in us. Divers exploring places like Yonaguni or the shelves of the North Sea speak of the eerie feeling of swimming where wind and footsteps once sounded. The fascination is not only scientific, it's emotional. We recognize on some quiet level that parts of our own story lie out there in the dark, not yet told. The drowned civilizations by the shore remind us that what seems stable can vanish. They remind us that the sea's edge is not a border engraved in stone, but a living frontier that moves with climate and time. And they remind us that, while all places can be lost, experience can be carried forward. The past is not only buried in sediment, it is also carried in us. When people looked up at the sky after the floods and thaws, they were not seeing exactly what their distant ancestors had seen. The stars themselves had not changed, of course, but the way they appeared from Earth had shifted subtly, slowly, yet meaningfully, over long stretches of time. As enormous ice sheets melted and their weight lifted, the planet's crust flexed. Land rose. Water redistributed. Even the balance of Earth's spin adjusted. The axis of our world wobbled ever so slightly in its long, slow cycle. Today we describe these motions with terms like precession, obliquity, and orbital eccentricity. Back then, people had only their eyes and memories. Over generations, those memories would have registered something quietly astonishing. The heavens move. The constellations that had risen at certain points in the year drifted. Stars that once appeared over a particular mountain or at a familiar point on the horizon shifted their positions. The star that marked due north changed over thousands of years as Earth's axis traced its slow circle in space. The alignment between seasonal markers on the ground solstice points, mountain notches, river bends, and the patterns overhead shifted little by little. Within a single human life, the change would have been subtle. But over several generations, elders might notice that what their grandparents had described no longer matched the sky exactly. For people who lived so closely tied to the land and seasons, who used the stars for navigation, hunting, gathering, and ritual timing, these shifts were not trivia. They mattered. Hunters and gatherers long used the rising and setting of particular stars as cues. When a certain constellation appeared at dawn, it might signal that a herd would be on the move soon, or that a particular plant was about to ripen. Fisherfolk could judge the seasons and tides, in part, by stellar patterns in the phases of the moon. As the sky gradually changed, calendars, those mental maps connecting Earth and heaven, had to be updated. Stories told around fires needed subtle revision. Rituals linked to specific star risings had to be adjusted. The sky was not a fixed dome. It was a moving text. Imagine a clear night in what is now the Middle East, sometime after the ice melt. The Milky Way sweeps across the sky like a pale river. A group settles around a fire. An elder points up, tracing figures among the stars, telling how the hunter in the sky chases his prey along a particular path. Years later, that elder student does the same for their own children. But the hunter's rising point has shifted just enough that the story needs a new landmark on the horizon to match. In this way, storytelling and observation braided together. The sky's slow motion became part of both myth and measurement. The moon, too, had a visible influence, though its cycles themselves stayed regular. As shorelines moved, the shape of bays and river mouths changed. Tides behaved differently in new configurations of land and sea. Communities living along coast would have noticed that some places became more dangerous, with stronger surges, while others became gentler. The link between the sky, the sea, and their own safety would have felt direct and immediate. Ritual life often mirrored this connection. Many ancient cultures timed ceremonies with lunar phases, solstices, and equinoxes. After the floods and climate swings, aligning human activity with the rhythms of sun, moon, and stars took on fresh importance. If the land could shift under your feet, perhaps the heavens offered a more reliable pattern, even if that pattern itself slowly drifted. In many indigenous traditions around the world, we find stories that encode astronomical knowledge, the slow lean of the earth, the movement of constellations, the long cycles of time. Some Aboriginal Australian stories, for example, reflect an awareness of changing star positions, consistent with precession over long spans. Ancient sky watchers were more precise and more patient than we sometimes give them credit for. The changes in the heavens also offered a powerful metaphor. Just as rivers changed course and coastlines moved, so too did the stars. Nothing above or below was entirely fixed, yet there was also stability. The sun still rose each day and marked the seasons with its arc. The moon kept its phases like a heartbeat. The same constellations cycled through the night year after year, even as their positions in the calendar shifted. For many early communities, aligning stone structures or sacred sites with celestial events may have been a way to anchor that sense of order. Later monuments like Stonehenge or the great alignments in Mesoamerica and Egypt are younger than the immediate post-flood period, but they inherit a tradition likely born then, marking time and change by setting stones in relationship to the sky. The idea that the heavens and earth are linked, that what happens above echoes what happens below, may well have been strengthened by the experience of living through such dramatic transformations of land and climate. When everything earthly feels unstable, the recurring paths of sun, moon, and stars take on deep meaning. Imagine a small community aligning a simple stone circle to sunrise at solstice. Each year, when the sun returns to that notch on the horizon, they know the cycle continues, even if rivers have changed routes or forests have shifted. The sky becomes a reassurance. The world may transform, but it does so within patterns. And yet, because the earth itself was flexing and wobbling under the rearranged weight of water and rock, even those patterns slid slowly over centuries. For some cultures, this may have contributed to a sense of ages or world cycles, long spans of time in which the sky's relationship to the land changes, marking one era from another. The post-flood sky, then, was both a clock and a canvas-keeping time and telling stories, shifting just enough to remind people that nothing, not even the stars, is completely still. As the seas receded into their new basins and the climate finally stabilized, the earth kept its own record of all that had happened, not in human words, but in stone, sediment, and fossil. High in mountains far from any modern shoreline, people sometimes found seashells and corals embedded in rock. Fossil fish and marine creatures appeared in layers of stone that lay thousands of feet above the present ocean. To ancient eyes, these were startling clues. How could shells from the sea be locked into the bones of a mountain? For people who had lived through floods or inherited fresh memories of them, such fossils may have been read as evidence that water had once covered even these heights, that the sea had been there before, and might come again. In many later cultures, the presence of seashells on mountains became part of arguments for great floods, divine acts, or past worlds destroyed and remade. Today we understand that those fossils often mark ancient seafloors lifted over millions of years by tectonic forces. But for early observers, they were a profound mystery. Physical proof that the relationship between land and sea had changed in ways beyond immediate experience. Imagine climbing with others into the hills to gather stone or hunt, and spotting a shell in the rock that looks exactly like those you've seen on distant beaches. You touch it. It doesn't move. It is part of the mountain itself. You carry that image back to your community. You tell the children. Over time, such discoveries feed into stories of earlier ages and earlier floods. They reinforce the sense that the earth can transform radically, that places can trade roles, that what is now mountain could once have been sea. Stone became another medium of memory in more deliberate ways too. As people settled in certain regions and developed more ritual life, they carved symbols and animals into rock, erected pillars, and painted on cave and cliff walls. Some of the world's earliest monumental sites, such as Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, date back roughly 11,000 to 12,000 years, close to the end of the Ice Age and the time of the Great Floods. There, carved animals and abstract symbols cover massive stone pillars, arranged in circular enclosures. Interpretations vary, and we must be cautious, but some researchers have suggested that at least part of the imagery could reflect responses to environmental changes and celestial events. Whether or not that specific claim holds, the timing alone tells us that people were building lasting stone monuments at precisely the moment when Earth's climate and coastlines were in flux. Stone was permanence in a world of impermanence. Cave art, too, sometimes shows swirls, waves, and flowing forms that may represent water, storms, or other dynamic forces. In rock shelters and open-air sites, carvings of boats, rivers, and fish appear in many regions over the millennia that followed. These images may have recorded more than hunts and daily life. They may have stood as reminders of the power of water, the presence of flood, the importance of rivers. Unlike wood or cloth, stone endures. What is etched or built in stone can last far beyond living memory, becoming a bridge across generations. Oral traditions often pointed to specific rocks, hills, or cliffs as markers of past events. A high boulder might be said to be where a boat rested after the waters receded. A ridge might be linked to a time when the sea once reached that far inland. Such stories would be told and retold as people passed those landmarks, reinforcing both the physical and the narrative landscape. In some cultures, high ground that provided refuge during floods became sacred. People built temples, shrines, or gathering places there. Even if later generations knew nothing of the original flood, the place retained a sense of importance, encoded as myth, custom, or taboo. Stone also recorded memory in subtler, microscopic ways. Layers of sediment in lake beds and ocean floors, which we now read with scientific tools, trap pollen grains, volcanic ash, dust, and tiny shells year after year. These layers are like pages, each capturing a snapshot of climate and environment at a particular moment. Without knowing it, people living through the floods were writing their story into those layers. Ash from their fires settled into mud, charcoal from burned forests, whether set by lightning or by human hands, fell into lakes. The pollen from the plants they tended or cleared drifted onto water surfaces and sank. The bones and shells from the animals they consumed sometimes ended up there too. When we drill core samples today, we pull up these layered archives. We see the signature of the great floods in coarse sediments, the signature of melting glaciers and changes to chemical composition, the signatures of forests and grasslands and the kinds of pollen present. We see, in other words, a parallel record to human memory, a record written not in words, but in mud. For ancient people, even without microscopes or chemical tests, the land itself was a book of signs. Fossil shells, layered cliffs, river terraces, buried tree stumps, all could be read as messages about what had once been. Those who paid attention could see that rivers had once flowed in different channels, that lakes had been higher or lower, that coasts had moved. Some of the earliest philosophers in places like ancient Greece later pondered these clues and proposed that land and sea had swapped places, that Earth had gone through cycles of flooding and drying. Their insights built on a much older foundation of observation and story. The shells on mountains and the stories carved in stone are, in a way, the Earth and humanity both keeping records of the same events, each in their own language. They tell us that the flood was real, not only as myth, but as transformation. They remind us that the sea once stood where it no longer does, that memory can be held in rock as surely as in song, and they suggest a quiet truth. Even after land and water have moved on, evidence remains for those who know how to look. When waters rise and remap the land, they do more than test bodies. They test minds, cultures, and the very ways people think about change. The great floods of 12,000 years ago taught a set of lessons that sank deep into humanity, not just as facts, but as values, stories, and reflexes we still recognize today. Some of those lessons were learned in the harshest ways possible. Others emerged slowly, distilled from generations of watching, adapting, and remembering. One of the first and clearest lessons was about impermanence. Before the floods, many people had lived on plains, river valleys, and coastlines that had seemed enduring. Seasons came and went. Animals migrated. But the basic shape of the land felt fixed. The deluge shattered that sense of stability. Land that had cradled communities for lifetimes vanished underwater. Rivers shifted channels, sometimes carving entirely new paths. Familiar landmarks disappeared. The message was blunt. Nothing in the physical world is guaranteed to remain the same, not even the ground itself. In myth and ritual, this hardened into a kind of warning. Tales of worlds drowned and reborn, of mountains once submerged, of seas that advanced and retreated, all reminded people that permanence is an illusion. That understanding, passed gently but firmly to each new generation, helped people live with eyes open to the possibility of change. A second lesson was resilience. As devastating as the floods and climate swings were, they did not erase humanity. People moved, adapted, tried new foods, new tools, new ways of organizing themselves. They carried seeds and skills to new lands. They rebuilt after loss. The flood myths we've been revisiting are not just records of destruction. They are testaments to survival. The ark, the boat, the high mountain, the rescued seeds, the animals released after the waters fall. These are all images of resilience, of the will to continue, and the creativity to find paths forward. Hearing such stories, children learn that catastrophe, while terrifying, was not the end of the story. That lesson has echoed across millennia. We are the descendants of people who refuse to give up. A third lesson was preparation. In many flood narratives, someone is warned. It might be a prophet, a king, a humble farmer, or a person in dialogue with animals or spirits. They are told, trouble is coming. Build, gather, move. Those who listen act in time. Those who do not are swept away. Beneath the supernatural framing lies a practical truth. Paying attention to the signs in nature matters. Rising water tables, changing river behavior, altered animal patterns, these could all foreshadow danger. Cultures that had lived through floods encoded the importance of heedfulness into story. They taught future generations not to assume that tomorrow would match today. A fourth lesson was about relationship with nature. The flood made it clear that humans were not separate rulers standing over the earth. They were part of a larger system, vulnerable to its shifts. Rivers, seas, storms, and ice were not mere backdrop. They were active forces that could take, give, and transform. In many traditions, this recognition became reverence. People offered gifts to rivers and oceans, performed rituals for rain or calm seas, asked permission before crossing or harvesting. The idea that water deserved respect, that one had to live in balance with it, was a direct response to the memory of its power. That respect was not only spiritual, it was strategic. Communities that treated water with caution, building on higher ground, leaving buffer zones near rivers, honoring floodplains, had better chances of surviving future events. A fifth lesson lay in the importance of memory itself. Floods taught people that forgetting was dangerous. If knowledge of past inundations faded, future generations would be caught unawares. Without writing, memory had to be carried in story, song, and practice. The persistence of flood myths across so many cultures shows that people succeeded. They kept remembering. The stories did more than recount an old disaster. They folded in advice. Listen to warnings, save seeds, share boats, seek high ground, respect water. In that sense, myth functioned as a survival manual, disguised as sacred tale. Another, more subtle lesson was about opportunity hidden in change. Floods destroyed, but they also created. They deposited fresh, fertile sediments along riverbanks and deltas, making agriculture more viable. They sculpted new inlets and lagoons rich with fish. They forced people into contact with new neighbors, sparking exchange and innovation. Communities that were able to see not only the loss, but also the possibilities in a reshaped world, thrived. The birth of farming, the growth of villages, the spread of new technologies, all were, in part, responses to the pressures and openings created by the floods and the climate that followed. There was also a lesson about community. In times of abundance, groups might live relatively isolated, relying on their own territory. In times of upheaval, cooperation became crucial. People shared food, labor, knowledge, and shelter. Those who worked together, for example, to build boats, raise walls, or plant communal fields, had a better chance of weathering the storms. This recognition found its way into cultural values. Many flood myths emphasize the importance of listening not just to gods, but to wise elders, helpers, and allies. Survival is rarely a solo achievement. It is almost always collective. Finally, and perhaps most profoundly, the floods taught humility. No tool, no weapon, no cleverness could hold back an ocean. People could not command glaciers to stop melting or rivers to stay within their banks. They could respond. They could flee, adapt, and rebuild. But they could not fully control. In many early worldviews, this understanding blossomed into a deep sense of human limitation. Even as people learned to farm, to build, to shape landscapes in small ways, the memory of water's vastness reminded them that some forces lay beyond their reach. That awareness shaped early philosophies and religions that emphasized living within the bounds of nature's cycles. These ancient lessons are not relics. They echo in the present, even if we frame them in different language. When we talk today about sea level rise, climate resilience, floodplain management, or disaster preparedness, we are, in a way, relearning what our ancestors already knew. That the earth changes, that we must pay attention, that we need each other, that humility and adaptability are not optional. The floods of 12,000 years ago wrote these truths into both rock and story. We continue to read from both. As we drift toward the close of this long journey with echoes of the forgotten earth, it may feel like we are moving away from the flood and back into our own time, but in many ways, we have never truly left it. The coasts carved by those ancient waters are the coasts we know now. The rivers that carry our commerce and our drinking water trace channels etched by glacial melt. The fertile plains that feed our cities are the same floodplains enriched by post-Ice Age sediments. The forests and grasslands that spread after the melt set the stage for agriculture, settlement, and the emergence of civilizations whose legacies we still live inside. Even our imagination bears the imprint of that watery past. The idea of the world drowned and reborn of catastrophe followed by renewal still appears again and again in books, films, spiritual teachings, and everyday metaphors. When we speak about starting over, about cleansing and rebirth, we are reaching, often unconsciously, for concepts shaped in that ancient age of water. Think again of the myths we've visited along this path. Utnapishtim in his ark, Manu in his boat guided by a divine fish, Deucalion and Pyrrha casting stones that become people, the Ojibwe animals diving for mud, the Hopi emerging into a new world after previous ones are washed away, Polynesian canoes carrying survivors over vast seas. Each of these stories is like a vessel itself, carrying fragments of an older reality, the fear, the awe, the grief, and the determination of people who watched the world they knew go under and chose to keep going. On the scientific side, our understanding of those events grows more detailed every year. We can now map old shorelines buried under the sea, measure ancient sea levels, trace the chemical fingerprints of glacial melt in ocean sediments, and reconstruct temperature swings through ice cores. In doing so, we have discovered that our ancestors, in their own way, were accurate witnesses. Seas did rise. Coasts did drown. Climates did whiplash. Myth and geology, so often cast as opposites, turn out to be complementary narratives of the same transformation, one focused on human meaning, the other on physical process. If there is a single thread tying all these strands together, it is resilience. Plants creeping across bare rock, forests regrowing in places once buried by ice, animals reclaiming ranges, humans experimenting with seeds, crafting new tools, forming new communities. Again and again, life finds a way to not only endure, but to rebuild. There is also, woven through it all, a sense of humility and wonder. Our ancestors learned that the earth could change far more rapidly than they had expected, that oceans could move, that climates could break their patterns, that creatures could vanish. They responded not only with fear, but with curiosity. They watched, learned, told stories, built rituals, and slowly, patiently adjusted. We inherit that same capacity. Today, we stand in our own time of shifting climate and rising seas. We watch coasts erode, glaciers shrink, and weather patterns stumble into new shapes. It can feel overwhelming, even paralyzing. Yet, when we look back across 12,000 years, we see that we are not the first to face such changes. Others lived through them. Others found ways to adapt, the lessons they encoded for us about paying attention, respecting water, working together, preparing, remembering, and holding on to hope, are still here, if we listen. Imagine standing at a shoreline tonight. The tide moves in and out, following the tug of the moon. Somewhere out there beneath the waves lie the remains of a forest, or a plain, or a village drowned long before history was written. Above you, the stars shine in constellations that have slowly drifted since those people last saw them. Between you and them stretches an unbroken chain of memory and adaptation. They watched their world change and told stories that would reach us. We watch ours and tell stories that will reach those who come after. The tide of memory and dream flows forward, carrying not just loss, but the knowledge that life can continue on the far side of upheaval. From Echoes of the Forgotten Earth, thank you for walking this long arc of time with me through melting ice, rising seas, returning forests, vanishing giants, the first seeds, the first villages, and the myths that still carry all of it in their currents. If this journey has soothed you, stirred your curiosity, or given you something quiet to reflect on, you're welcome to return. Like the tide, we'll come back again with other stories from the deep past of this world we share. Until then, may the steady rhythms of the earth calm your thoughts. May the old lessons of resilience sit gently with you. And may you feel, in some small way, that you too are part of this long, enduring story of water, change, and survival.